Well, that was exciting music at 10 o'clock in the morning. Good day, I think, is the right thing to say here. What a delight to see so many people at 10 o'clock in the morning, because it has to be said that the champagne was not held back last night. So well done to you all for being here, is all I have to say. So we're at one of the, I think, most wonderful literary festivals. It's quite new, but it's already established a sense of being somewhere where authors and readers come together to talk about things that matter. Many festivals, people kind of come in and out, and there isn't really that sense of a collegiate project, if you like. But here at Clifton, it is an extraordinary powerhouse after only 5 years, maybe? That's you, Natalie.
Yes, five, sorry.
Because you're involved, you know that. Okay, very fantastic. But what we're doing this morning, ahead of an amazing day of talks, is to celebrate the unsung heroines, if you like. The fact that history has always been made by all of us, men and women together, but very often within the past, the writing of history has belonged in the hands of a very small number of people, which means that often women's contributions have been forgotten. And sometimes it's been deliberate, other times it's been what you might call benign neglect, and other times it has been a sense that women were very famous in their day, but for whatever reason, within legacy, their contributions have been forgotten. And I can't imagine a better panel to have than this extraordinary warrior queens, all of you, and quiet revolutionaries, and to talk about women that have been written out of the record in particular. Now, I'm going to quickly go along. You've all had your programmes, so I'm not going to read out everybody's dazzling biographies, but just so you know who is who. This is the wonderful Natalie Livingstone, who is one of the powerhouses behind this festival, has written 2 extraordinary books, which I expect you've read, which is The Women of Rothschild and obviously The Mistresses of Clifton. And it has been incredibly important in putting those women back into the record, because one of the things that is key is that women writing other women's stories, and that is what this panel is going to be about. Sitting in the middle is Catherine Ostler, who is the author of the wonderful The Duchess Countess, and you'll explain why she's got both a little bit later, but one of the most extraordinary trials of the 18th century. And when one woman was essentially surrounded by thousands of men making a judgment on who she was and what she had done. And again, you have put her back in the record in the way that Natalie does, and you are the other powerhouse behind this festival. Then we have Lucasta Miller, who many of you will know for the Bronte myth, but has also written an extraordinary book about Leticia Landon. Now, in my book, Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries, I have a whole chapter on the writers that have been lost, the female writers that have been lost. And I didn't know her. So my index is, I'm adding in pencil now, so thank you for that. And then at the end, we have Susan Jonusas, who has written a wonderful book about, I mean, this sounds a slight contradiction, a wonderful book about serial killers. But in fact, her next book, which is not yet out, is about a showgirl and how her reputation was traduced, essentially. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to ask you all a little bit about your books and how you found your lost women. And then we'll talk more generally about how we put this record straight, how we complete history. Not taking out the wonderful men, but adding the amazing women in. And many of you will know that statement from Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to run for president in America, who said, if they won't give you a seat at the table, take your old folding chair. So we're going to start with you, Natalie. Tell us about the importance of the women of Clifton and indeed the Rothschilds, who actually, that's why we're here at this festival. That's why you started it.
Well, basically, the interesting thing is that the 2 books that I've written are examples of different kinds of exclusion of women. With the Mistresses of Clifton, there was just the stories of these women have just been discarded. The diaries were thrown away, the letters were burned, there was absolutely no trace of them. With the women of Rothschild, it was a more willful exclusion. But taking back to the beginning, you know, my book came about because I came into Clifton when we became involved in it in April 2012, and I looked around, and in the Great Hall, I saw all these portraits of these women. And I didn't know who they were, and I was absolutely intrigued by their stories. And I tried to read up on them, I tried to find out more about them, and there was nothing apart from the odd footnote. Yes. And actually, from exploring those footnotes, what transpired was that there were 5 extraordinary women from 1666, really until the present day, who not only shaped the story of Clifton, but were also hugely influential socially, politically, artistically, and their contribution has just been completely left out of the record just because of careless archiving and the fact that their stories have been taken over by men.
And do you think, when you were looking around and you were playing detective, really, I think that's what we all do in our historical research, play detective, did you have a sense of asking yourself a question why it had happened, that they'd been taken out of the record? Or was it just curiosity and then that story started to reveal itself as you did the research?
Yeah, well, I just didn't know who they were. I mean, with the exception of the John Singer Sargent portrait of Nancy Astor, I did not know who I didn't know names to these faces, and I was absolutely intrigued by their stories, and I wanted to find out what role they had played in building this amazing house.
And in terms of, you know, you are a woman in the modern times, putting these other women back in history. Did you start to feel a fellow feeling with them? The idea of the importance of women archiving other women's stories?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing about Clifton is possibly the only woman who was really a household name is Christine Keeler. And really, she's just known for coming out of the swimming pool, dripping with water on a balmy summer night into the hungry gaze of John Profumo. So the only woman who...
That really... is a brilliant way to put that, actually, frankly. I mean, no, if you ever need a new career in tabloid journalism, my God, you are on it.
but that is the only woman who, in popular imagination, one associates with Clifton. So it's so kind of basic. It's about sex. It's about, you know, eroticism. And actually, there's so much more. The women who, from 1666, the incredible achievements that these women have done. I mean, you know, one of them was very, very close to Jonathan Swift and helped him write a lot of his letters and political manifestos. And he said she was the wisest woman I've ever met. So there's so much more than just the nudity and the dripping water and, you know, the footprints on the terracotta tiles.
Yes, exactly.
You know, the discarded swimsuit.
This is getting awfully saucy for 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. I'm sorry to have a jumper on, frankly. Catherine.
A red swimsuit.
Yeah, no.
Baywatch. We go Baywatch.
My dear, that ship has sailed as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going out in public in a swimsuit ever again. But tell us about the Duchess Countess, because there is an amazing moment in your book, which for me is the Joan of Arc moment. You know, Joan of Arc, 1431, the one female figure surrounded by the male inquisitors, and you have that in the trial. So tell us a bit about her.
Yes, well, she was mostly known for having had a bigamy trial in Westminster Hall, where, you know, I don't know how many people, I did go and queue up, when was it, a month ago, and I did have this incredible moment where I thought, there is our late monarch. In here in 1776, this entire room was lined with red seats, all taken by the peerage of England, who all got 7 tickets. And every peer in the land, of which there were 137 who could make it, were the jury, and every single one of them got to say whether she was guilty or not. And some women came as sort of guests, but she was tried. One woman was tried by 137 men, and they all had to stand up at the end and say their verdict. Every single one of them said they were guilty, apart from one, her old friend, the Duke of Newcastle, who said guilty, but not intentionally, as a sort of favour. But
that's the kind of friend you really don't want, isn't it?
I know, it wasn't that great. But the images, and everybody drew this scene, and you do get this one tiny sort of figure, this sort of widow, 55, she said she was 50, but that's by the by, in black, standing there with these thousands of people in Westminster Hall. But I came across her story as a literal sort of footnote in a wonderful book by our esteemed co-chair, Simon Sebag Montefiore, who had written this brilliant book about Catherine the Great. And this very eccentric woman had turned up in St. Petersburg to try and make friends with Catherine the Great. And he wrote this sort of extraordinary sort of description of her yacht. She built this yacht. She was calling herself a duchess. She wasn't. Horace Walpole called the Duchess Countess because she was actually married to a duke and an earl at the same time. The boat was full of animals. There were sort of kind of copulating monkeys on one end and an orchestra on the other. And it said she'd fled London in disgrace. And I thought, what? I haven't heard of this person. Who is she? And I was sort of right in there. I thought, so she sounds like the sort of person I like. Anyway, so I sort of looked into it. And then I had this, and I do go down that sort of curious rabbit hole you go down. And then she was sort of demonised by the press. And, as a journalist, I was sort of gripped by all the press coverage and knew that it might be unreliable in parts. And so I began to think, she was disgraced, and everyone said she was this dreadful sort of histrionic person, and she'd had these 2 concurrent marriages. And then in the British Library, by some chance, quite recently, there was a very obscure sort of academic publisher who'd found this edited manuscript written by an 18-year-old girl who'd been at the trial, same age as my daughter, who'd been sitting there. No one had read it. And this girl had written down her spontaneous take, and everybody, all the newspapers were in it, James Boswell, everybody was there, and they'd given their account. And she had written something completely different. She'd been incredibly sympathetic and very emotional, and she criticised everybody. She said, they're all so judgmental. This is a human being. And I thought, in her, she then went on to become quite well known herself, Anna Porter and Anna Larpent, she was otherwise known. And she was a sort of young female prodigy. She was a brilliant writer and very observant. But she basically told me the change in the status of women in the 18th century, which is they were, and the change of the status of marriage, which we see in the novel, which was, it was a dynastic match, it was organised, it was for other people, and or was it a sort of romantic ideal, and you could make up your own mind and people could make mistakes? And there was this young 18-year-old writing this
at that tipping
story,
point.
And I thought, this is really interesting. Nobody's written this, and actually there's a whole other way of looking at this woman's story, and I want to find out what it is.
And I think one of the things that the book does so well is the idea that history is a pendulum. It goes backwards and it goes forwards. And there is always this idea that, particularly with women's stories, that things each generation get a little bit better than they were before. We can see on our television screens this is not true. The day before the Taliban went back into Afghanistan in August 2021, there were more women in the Afghan parliament than any parliament in the world. 24 hours later, there were no female MPs. So we know this, but we tend to assume that in the past people tell the truth. Whereas the evidence is that people don't always tell the truth. So that's what you're doing, is reclaiming the story as it might really have been, rather than the narrative that society wanted. Yeah,
also we all know, historians all know that technology is our friend, so there's things you can discover in the last 20 years that were just out of bounds for people writing, in the last 200. So there's just the information, the data, the bank accounts, the whole story can be sort of reframed just by that alone.
They're all wonderful books so far. Obviously, there's a bookshop, ladies and gentlemen, and you need to buy them all. That's it, I think, is my job as the chair.
Yeah,
isn't it? Yes, absolutely. And signed, yes, as Natalie's pointed out, signed. Christmas is a-coming, that's all I have to say. Lucasta, in my book, Warrior Queens of Quiet, there's nearly 1,000 women who've been written out of the record, some of whom people will know, and others they won't. Obviously, I start with writers because women writing their own stories is essential to women's history. But I didn't know your girl. So can you tell the audience about her? Because I was like, how have I missed her?
You're certainly not alone today, but what is so extraordinary is that she was one of the most famous writers in the country in her lifetime. She was the leading poet of the era, a very strange era in literary history, between the end of the Romantics and the beginning of the Victorians. So, Byron's dead by 1824, and then you don't really get much going on until the rise of Dickens at the end of the 1830s. Except that you do get something going on. And what you get going on is Leticia Landon. You were talking earlier about how, about dealing with sources and how, you expect them to tell the truth. Now, researching Leticia Landon's story was, it actually nearly drove me mad at times, and it was no consolation to discover that her first biographer slit his throat in 1845, shortly after publishing her biography. And you can see from that she did have a biography published of her quite so early. She died in 1838. Shows you how well known she was. But it transpired that this biography was actually part of a completely concerted and calculated cover-up about her story. I mean, there are some women who, as you said, are sort of marginalised, forgotten by, as you put it, benign neglect. But in this case, Leticia Landon's story was so toxic that basically the publishing industry, the literary establishment, wanted it completely brushed under the carpet. She had been found dead with a bottle of prussic acid in her hand in Cape Coast Castle in present-day Ghana, which is this, I've been there, it's this really, really forbidding former slaving fort where the slaves used to get shipped out from the door of no return to the Americas. And at the very end of her career, she had gone out there, she's aged 36, and she'd married the governor of Cape Coast Castle. She'd been found dead 6 weeks later. At the time, some people said she'd been murdered. It turned out that the governor already had an African wife, or I mean, not what they would call country wife, a local partner. And so this African woman had the finger of suspicion pointed at her. It was claimed, oh, was it an accident? Of course, some people thought maybe it was suicide. But all her friends, wrote letters to the Times, published articles saying, oh no, all her letters home from Africa, she was so cheerful she couldn't possibly have killed herself. This was all a smokescreen. Leticia Landon's story is one of those ones where, I mean, I know that we love recovering stories of sort of, wonderful, powerful, strong women who can be role models to us. Leticia Landon's story isn't like that. It's a very disturbing story. When I first found out about her, I thought, oh, she seems like this really modern woman. She lives alone. She works. She's a professional writer. She seems so independent. Actually, it turns out that she'd been created as the female Byron by the editor of a magazine who'd also become her lover. She was 18 at the time. He was 20 years older with a family. And during the course of this career in which they together had created her as this persona, the female Byron, where she was phenomenally famous, she had this story which, if it came out into the public arena, would completely destroy her. We're talking about an era of sexual hypocrisy and double standards. And the really sad thing is that by the time she leaves London, all her female friends have deserted her, because at that point in history, for a respectable woman to consort with a fallen woman was the death of her reputation too. So
also, it's being logical about where the power is. In the end, she had no power, so they're making a choice about their own place in society, aren't they?
Exactly. She had the talent, but she didn't have the power. And, if we think that people, trolling each other on Twitter is bad today, you should see the things that were written about her by men who worked for these magazines in this literary industry in the 1830s, who were meant to be her colleagues. And they were, casting aspersions on her in ways that she became utterly terrified that her true story would come out and she'd be destroyed. She wouldn't be able to earn her living anymore.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an extraordinary story, and it plays back to one of the things that we were talking about before we came on the platform, about in terms of putting women back into history. It's incredibly important that women's place in history is not about likability. You can't just put back the women that you approve of or you agree with or even that you like. It's about putting everybody back in order to get, and we'll come back to some of your ladies a bit later, because they're not necessarily the ones that you'd want to sit down and have a drink with, are they? Some of your ladies in the book. But Susan, I just want to bring you in. You've written a wonderful book about a family group of serial killers. It's a very Lee Child type of read, which is fantastic. But in fact, as pertains to this panel, you are writing about another woman who has had, as many of the women that we're talking about on the panel, her reputation was in the hands of male commentators. And it really did for her, didn't it? So can you just explain a little bit about who she is and where she comes from and why you know her?
Yes, so when I was in America researching my first book with my partner, we were listening to a book about the American prison systems. I became really interested in that, and specifically in Texas. And I bought a book on the history of the prison rodeo in Texas. And in this book, there was a picture of a woman, and she's got this amazing 60s haircut. She's in a dress. She's mid-performance. She's singing. She's pointing her finger. And I just thought, oh my goodness, who is that? And underneath the caption, it said, Candy Bar, former inmate performs at the prison rodeo. And I thought, well, if she's got a name like that, why don't we still know who she is? And so I went away and I did some research. And in the 1950s, 1960s, she was one of the most famous and kind of notorious women in America. She's this tiny little blonde lady with very distinctive features. And she was performing on stage with people like Sammy Davis Jr. She was involved with the mob, with Jack Ruby. And then right at the height of her fame, she's sent to prison on a narcotics charge. And this is she previously had shot one of her husbands.
But only one.
Only one. But he had actually been pimping her out. So she'd run away from an abusive home as a child and ended up in a sex trafficking ring. And she's also widely considered to be the first porn star. And this became a huge cultural touch point. And it also really helped her with this burlesque career that she developed. But she is one of these women, I think, who was really struggling to find how she could have her own agency. And after she shoots her first husband, she becomes a very successful dancer. She's earning thousands and thousands of dollars a week. She's supporting her 14 siblings, her child, her extended family. And then that's all just taken off her. And at her trial, as she's testifying, the judge takes a picture of her and he's asked about it. And he says, oh, well, she was a pretty girl. And that's just, this is totally fine, totally acceptable to behave like that towards her, because I think obviously she was a stripper essentially. And because she was in that role, everyone felt entitled to her, men, women, people who supported her, people who didn't like her. And after she came out of prison, she was hugely generous, and she was really desperate to help people who had suffered injustices, like she felt she had her whole life. And so she gave away all her money that she'd earned while she was stripping. She would read about people in the newspaper who were struggling with debt. She'd turn up at their house and she'd say, here's the money to pay it off. And so she died in a house with no running water, in total obscurity. And lots of people over the years had approached her wanting to tell her story, but they were all men. And she did not trust men to be able to tell the story because they were so focused on the sexual element of her life and that performance. And like, she loved poetry, she loved Emily Dickinson, and she wanted to be known as Juanita Slusher, a woman in her own right, not Candy Bar. But obviously Candy Bar.
I feel all her names are a little bit ropey, actually.
I know.
I think she should have had a Duchess Countess name.
I know, it's a bit more, but she was called Candy Bar because she liked to eat Snickers between performances, so that's where that name comes from. But I just felt like she's got such a distinctive voice, and she's got an incredible sense of humour for someone who went through so much, which I think you often see with women, especially when they've gone through all of that. They often tend to be very humorous. And I mean, the slang she uses, she feels like a character out of a James Ellroy novel, but there's so much more to her than that. And I'm just really excited to be able to show everybody what an important woman she was, and also the kind of what reactions to her teach us about America in that time period, and attitudes towards women and sex and narcotics, and the kind of changing idea of surveillance, and what a woman in that period, what is power for a woman in that period, especially when it involves kind of sexualization of herself.
Yeah, and you have sold this. When's it out? Next year?
It's I guess like 2024.
Well, you need to write faster.
I know, I will.
You know, we're all gog now. So now everybody, you've all said a bit about your book and your determination to put women back in. So it seems to me that there are a couple of things that are really important here. One of them is that many women whatever class background, period of history they come from, for all sorts of reasons, is reduced to one thing. You could call this reputation, you could call it anything else. So, you know, the example I always give is Florence Nightingale. So we know that Florence Nightingale was a nursing pioneer, but that determination that she can be seen as that. But of course, she was one of the great statisticians of the 19th century, and as many of you will know, it invented the pie chart. It's not something that's ever really been useful in my life, the pie chart, I must admit, but it's that idea that women are reduced to the one thing. Now, I know with some of your amazing women, the Clifton women in particular, that sense that they were seen absolutely just as the mistress of somebody or the wife of someone. So do you just want to say a little bit about that, about how you excavated the whole woman, or the whole women, I suppose, in your book, and then all of you just dive in, because I think you're all doing the same thing, which is trying to say this was a real flesh and blood person, and let's put her back.
Well, sometimes it was very difficult to, because there was absolutely no source material, especially my earliest woman, Anna Maria, Countess of Shrewsbury, for whom Clifton was built. And Clifton was built by the Duke of Buckingham, who fell madly in love with Anna Maria, Countess of Shrewsbury, and built it as a monument to their affair. Now, the only thing that I could find, only piece of information I could find about Anna Maria, was a book written about this horrifically slutty woman who just went from one man to another, and as a consequence, as a punishment, her children were taken away. Actually, what I found out about Anna Maria is that the story is much more nuanced. You know, as you said, the power, the only currency that she had at that time was sex. The only way that she could make her way up in society was sex. You know, she met a duke. She met the Duke of Buckingham, and she basically traded up. And it's very difficult. Initially, when I was looking at her, of course, you know, you judge about how can you leave your husband, how can you leave your children, but then, you know, you kind of think she had very, very limited choices, and actually, she had very little choice because the House of Lords actually petitioned for her children to be taken away from her. And that was something that wasn't in the records. I had to really delve in and find out. And actually, her affair was deemed so scandalous that in the end she was sent off to a nunnery, and the Duke of Buckingham was left to die in Clifton on his own. So it's a really tragic story, and actually no one wins and no one's happy. So it's not just about this insatiate countess, as she was known. It's about, you know, a woman who was just trying to pave her way in incredibly difficult circumstances. You know, I mean, I could go on, you know.
No, but we don't, because now people are going to buy the book if they haven't already got it. See, there you are. So you don't need to. No, but I mean, of course, that kind of the threat of not being married or being divorced or your children being taken will, in the end, in the 19th century, lead to the great campaigner Caroline Norton, who is responsible for just not accepting this. You know, that she was divorced, petitioned for divorce, her husband refused to accept it. She wrote to Queen Victoria saying, it should make a difference to women's lives that the monarch is a queen. And several bits of legislation ending up with the 1870 Married Women's Property Act. Because before that, essentially, women were property. I mean, they had fewer rights than the domestic servants that they employed, in some respects. So, I mean, that's what all of you are trying to do, is saying, well, you can't make a judgment from the 2022 on the decisions that women were making in the 18th century, the 17th century, the 19th century, isn't it? I mean, Catherine, I think that you were talking very much about reputation and how incredibly easy it is. If you want to destroy a woman, you destroy her reputation. You know, one of the, I suppose, the most famous examples is Theodora of Byzantium, who had 3 biographies written about her by I can never say the word Procopius, something like that. And depending on whether he thought she was good or bad, they are 3, you'd think you were reading about 3 different women. She's either a harlot and a stripper, or she's an incredibly principled woman who changed everything, or she's a manipulating, you know. So say something about reputation.
There's also this sort of first mover advantage with biography, which is in history, which is the first person who gets it out of the stocks. That can somehow become the definitive version, and it may or may not go question for a very long time. So in the case of Elizabeth Chudleigh, the Countess, she died in Paris in 1788. And she had been so scandalous because of this trial we were talking about that the first version of her life appeared on the presses within a month. And the division between journalism, fiction, non-fiction, not being quite as clear as it is now, it was the story they thought would sell, and the story that, you know, we all want to write the story we think will sell, but, you know, this became, it was a biography, but really it was 50% fiction, and, you know, it was terrific. It was a bestseller at the time, but it sort of acquired, you know, the veneer of truth. So most of it, I would say, didn't really sort of stack up on further examination.
Did it make you, it's going to sound a bit daft, but did it make you cross? When you were researching, did you keep going, I can't believe that? Or, you know, what was your emotion as you were finding these things?
Yes, it made me sort of cross, but you know, but also excited. We were talking about the sort of private detective thing. When you have the aha moment, that's wrong. That was sort of so, you know, that over sort of came the. But we all know also, it's the sort of exaggerate and simplify rule of journalism, that, you know, stories are much more nuanced than you sort of they first appear. So, you know, I found myself reading, thanks to Google Translate, I'm afraid, but anyway, Estonian property records, because this woman who was, as we were saying, known for one thing, which is being married to two men, had also tried to become a farmer and run an orchestra, she was very musical, in Estonia. And I found all these records that no one had looked at because they were in Estonian. And I thought this woman had so many other sort of projects going on that no one, so it's sort of, so yes, I was a bit angry, but, you know, the press, I don't know, they were very corrupt. So there were newspapers who wrote in her favour, and they wrote as much nonsense as the ones who were against her, because it depended which side of the trial was paying them off at the time. So it was almost got too complicated to be angry, actually, because I couldn't really. Everybody had a sort of, you know, a stake in, as you were saying, there were sort of layers of involvement to this. There's sort of politics involved, people tried to sort of suppress the truth. Yeah. And it's never straightforward.
I mean, it was entertainment.
It was entertainment. It was also, you know, factions involved, you know, sort of, you know, she was caught in the Whig Tory fight, her great mentor had been a patriot Whig. You know, so people hated people like Horace Walpole hated her because she hadn't fallen out with his father. You know, it's sort of...
Yeah, I mean, in the world of literary London that Leticia Landon was operating in, it was incredible. I mean, factionalism doesn't even begin to describe it. I mean, you know, I'm sure we've all maybe felt not 100% happy sometimes with a book review. In those days, people literally fought duels and sort of committed grievous bodily harm over such things.
Give it time. The day is young.
But I think that the issue of reputation is so interesting, and one of the things I find fascinating about Leticia Landon is that in her own poetry, she actually talks about this stuff. While she is creating herself as this celebrity figure, she's also writing poems which rhyme the words fame and shame repeatedly. She thinks about what it means to be famous. I lived only in others' breath, she said. And I think you're so right, what you said about the way in which the reputation of women is, and, you know, following how they've been reconstructed at different times in history, is completely fascinating. And I mean, you mentioned Florence Nightingale and how the Lady with the Lamp just goes nowhere near to encompassing what she really achieved in her career. But in a sense, that image of the Lady of the Lamp was totally perfect for that period, the height of the Victorian cult of domesticity, you know.
It's the angel in the house.
Exactly. I found that a lot with the Bronte sisters, who I worked on. I mean, it's interesting that Leticia Landon was this very famous character. The Brontes read and admire her when they're young, but when they come to publish after her death, they do so under male pseudonyms because they believe that critics are prejudiced against women writers.
And it's the lovely Virginia Woolf quote, isn't it, that for most of history, Anonymous was a woman.
Yes.
You know, it's a lovely quote.
That's great.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know, did you come across the amazing writer Rachel Luzzatto Mulpurgo, who was 18th century. She was the first woman to write poetry in Hebrew under her own name for 2,000 years. And amazing. People just didn't believe a woman had written it. And her poetry has a lot of this absolutely heartbreaking critique of her own invisibility.
Yes.
And she often signed her poems Rachel Morpurgo, Stillborn, because because they just said a woman can't have written this poetry. Anyway, that's an aside, but she's...
Funny enough, I am now writing about one of her family. Well,
Are you?
Yes,
But,
yes, later on. But
well, there we are. You see, I mean, because there's so many
Morpurgo's
stories, aren't there?
very
There's so many
interesting.
stories. But I also love, I mean, in different ways, obviously you, Natalie, here, and you are putting the women back into these stories that are there on the walls, but people don't know. But with all of you, you have, it's quite often been a mention. You use the word footnote, which I think is a really good one, that there's a tiny thread that you then start to pull, and that's when you reveal this extraordinary woman at the end of it. Because presumably, Susan, you didn't think, do you know what I need to do? I need to write about the first porn star. I imagine that wasn't your historical thesis.
No, I mean, I've always been very, very interested in kind of golden era Hollywood and the intersection between kind of the establishment and the mob and all the aesthetics in that period that I think, we've seen a big resurgence in recently. There's a lot of period dramas set in that time. We're kind of obsessed with this idea of the constructed woman, like this with Blonde, for example, which is obviously hugely divisive, but like the idea of what the power that women had in that period, I think we kind of look back and we think, oh, well, they created these characters for themselves. But obviously within the studio system, that is completely constructed usually by men who are like, we want to sell this type of woman to this type of people. And I think what really fascinated me about Candy was that she talks about how she created this persona to survive her trauma. She said when she was Candy Bar and she was up on the stage, even though she was taking her clothes off, she felt like she was untouchable. People couldn't get to her. Like this persona of herself, it hadn't suffered the kind of sexual exploitation that Juanita had. And then the fact that when she wanted to leave that persona behind and was ready to confront her trauma, people didn't want to do that because, it deeply unpleasant and lots of finger pointing at the establishment and the police as well, who were involved in some of the trafficking she experienced. And I think it's trying, and then she wrestles for the rest of her life about, do I take advantage of this thing that I built to survive, or do I try and shun it? And she kind of goes through waves of it her whole life. I mean, in her 40s, she becomes the first woman over 40 to pose nude for Playboy. But she does it so she can tell her story, because they're the only people who want to interview her. So she sacrifices kind of that. She says, okay, I'll appear as Candy Bar one more time if you will let me tell you what happened to me. And so you then have this magazine spread, which has these, hugely explicit photos, and then her talking about sexual abuse she suffered as a child. And I think it's that kind of really jarring combination of images that really drew me to that story, because she still understood that to talk about what she'd experienced, she did have to capitalize on her own sexualization.
Well, it's also, I mean, all of the women that you have written about and I've written about, it's about if you have a platform, how do you use it?
Yeah.
And it's a luxury to say, well, I can't possibly make use of being very beautiful or very wealthy or well married in order to raise my voice, because it might be the only platform you've got. So, I mean, you've all done that. I'm going to go to the audience in a moment for some questions. But I want to just bring it back to here, to Clifton itself, because obviously this is an extraordinary and historic place. I mean, obviously Nancy Astor, the first woman to take her seat in the House of Parliament was here, and you obviously mentioned Christine Keeler and all of those things. But in terms of honouring the legacy of this house, but by putting the women back in, I mean, in a way, that is why you and others founded this festival, isn't it?
I mean, that's the reason, we're here. This festival is the result of reclaiming Footnotes. So, hopefully it's become a very glamorous and interesting footnote now. But if not, if not for that fascination and that intrigue about who these women were and actually trying to find their stories, and it's, yeah.
I mean, when I was writing Warrior Queens, I mean, it is about putting women back into history, but the spine of it is actually discovering that I had my own lost woman from history. And it was a very strange experience, and it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for lockdown. I always knew there was somebody in our family who wrote, But it was said as if, she's on the flower rota for Sunday. It was, she wrote. What I discovered was, during lockdown, that she was a really famous novelist in her day. She was called Lily Watson. She wrote 14 novels. Her most famous, The Vicar of Langthwaite, when it came out, the Prime Minister Gladstone himself wrote to the Times to say, hurrah, there is a new novel from Lily Watson. She wrote a lot of devotional texts. She wrote correspondence. She was a correspondent for Girls' paper, which became Woman's Own. There is not a single mention of her anywhere.
Do you know what's interesting? That in the course of my research of the Rothschild, I found so many articles, so many books, volumes that had been written by the women and their names had been excluded. And in fact, Louisa Rothschild, who spent 9 years, most of the 1840s, writing this incredible series of books called The Cheap Jewish Library, she was so terrified that anyone would find out that she was editing and had written a lot of the stories, that she had to have an interlocutor. She had to have this rabbi called Rabbi David de Sola, who put his name to it. And the only person who knew that she was doing this incredible project, which at the time, to encourage women's literacy, women to read stories about, Judaism, was really quite remarkable, was the only person who knew was her mother.
Yes. And that is a theme for a lot of women's writing, that it was either deliberately suppressed and destroyed, but equally that sort of fear of what would happen. I mean, the irony is that the first named author in history is a woman, Enheduanna, 23rd century BCE. And we know this because her name was on alabaster discs and some of the temple poetry, as it was always called. And before that, it was never accredited. But the joy of that story is we know that it was her, the first author named in history, because of the excavations in Samaria, in Ur, in the 19th and 20th century. And in 1923-4, Leonard and Catherine Woolley were part of that excavation that found this evidence. And who was Catherine Woolley? A good friend of Agatha Christie, and indeed was immortalised in They Came to Baghdad. And I love that idea that the biggest selling author in world history, Agatha Christie, is connected to the very first author in world history. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is because I'm a novelist, not a real historian. Anyway, let's take some questions from the audience. Gentleman in the front. Oh, hello.
Jack Blackburn from The Times. Catherine, you mentioned the impact that technology has had, and Kate, when you talk about your ancestor, I assume that technology was a part of tracing that. How is that opening up women's stories from history? And does that mean that we can all look forward to sort of many more characters who are a lot more fun, that we can get a lot more colour and detail about?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. Thank you, Jack. Who'd like to jump in?
Well, I think absolutely yes. I mean, as we all know, non-fiction, you're a hostage to your material. And so now you can do this sort of wonderful global search and find letters and, all sorts of things and sort of name searches. And these things are so recently unavailable. I was talking about the things I found in Estonia, but there was in sort of French archives, and particularly people who travelled, and the woman I wrote about did travel a lot. So you've got this sort of multi-source material. It used to be that you just go to the library and read whatever was in the British Library, and now you can find everything sort of in the world about a person.
And the other thing that's fascinating is when you start researching in the 1600s, it's just letters. That is the voice that you can put to women. What I found amazing about the Rothschilds was when I got to the 20th century, I could actually see these women come to life. I could hear Miriam Rothschild on desert island discs. I could watch her present nature programs, and it was just so. It was absolutely incredible to see these characters come to life and to actually hear their voices, not have to imagine, but actually hear and see who they were. So yeah, I mean, it was incredibly helpful. But then you have so much material and you have so much to get through that it's almost impossible to edit it and to know which bits to include and which bits not to. So it's
there's some wonderful sort of crowdsourcing things that I'm sure you know. Andrew, you know about this Royal Georgian Papers online, where people are spending hours putting stuff up on the internet. Anyone can read it. And this is incredible stuff. And it's not just letters and sort of diaries, it's sort of recipe books, and bank accounts tell their own stories. You know, I had a huge fun with the
Wills are very handy.
Royal Bank of Scotland.
Well,
yeah.
Well, the whole point of the Rothschild book. I mean, I wouldn't have written the book. Well, I wouldn't have written the book if not for Andrew, because it was his idea. But the reason
Royalties coming your way. I think.
I don't think there are many of those. But the reason the women of the Rothschild family was so interesting, because a will by the founding father of the Rothschild dynasty, Meyer Amschel Rothschild, in 1812 excluded the women from the family business. So what he effectively had done is he had relegated all of the women in his family to footnotes in history. So it was then up to them to decide how to negotiate that position and how to express themselves in those very, very limited confines. They were relegated to second-class citizens, and they had to find ways of expressing themselves.
I mean, the only thing I would say, Jack, about technology, it is obviously terrific. You have to double check all the sources, because Wikipedia, bless them, it is brilliant, but 90% of the people who post on Wikipedia are men, and only 19% of biographies on Wikipedia are of women. But, and you do need to double check against other official records. But the thing that concerns me as someone who's curious rather than being a historian is that an enormous amount of what gives a life texture and colour and grit, if you will, we're not going to have in the future, because it will be in text messages and emails. And at the moment, the digital archives work, but the power will at some point run out, or it will run out in certain places. So that sense of the letters, you know, the way that you, I think it was Neil McGregor said, the charisma of things. I do fear for that, about the whole picture, because of us not keeping things as a paper record.
That is so true. I remember once looking at a Charlotte Bronte manuscript in the Pierpont Morgan Library, and I'd gone in, I was feeling quite sort of, it wasn't a great day, I wasn't feeling that excited, and I had put this, they brought this thing on the desk, they didn't even make me wear gloves, it was totally this sort of naked piece of paper covered in this tiny writing in which the young Charlotte Bronte had written out her secret fantasies while she was sitting in a classroom teaching these recalcitrant, rather asinine, she said, girls. And it was suddenly this little window onto the past, this sense, and then this enormous tear formed in the corner of my eye. And I had this sort of, no, thank God it didn't.
Oh my God, that's the scene in the film.
I agree. I think we can all relate to the thrill of those, you know, having said all that, just to turn it all on its head, there's nothing like the thrill of seeing someone you're writing about handwriting for the first time and thinking they wrote that, and there you are, you're so close to them, and it's like you finally arrived in the room with them.
Yeah,
so
But then it's almost impossible to decipher, because some of them look like, some of the writing looks like a seismograph, and you spend hours trying to figure out what they're actually saying.
When I went to the Kansas State Archives for my first book, I was completely overwhelmed to discover that there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters, documents, expense sheets for private detectives. But one of the things that really got me was I'd been reading about one of the victims' families for a very long time. You become very familiar with the people. And then I found a letter that was written by the brother of one of the victims, just talking about what it had done to his family and how desperate he was to find the perpetrators, and how, because he had actually interacted with them, and how guilty he felt that he'd done that. And then he writes a description of what he remembers about them so that they can compare it to a detective who thinks he's found them. And then just seeing his signature at the bottom, just Alexander York, and the way it gets you to be able to fight, you feel like you're so much closer to that person when you have the physical document. And so when I go to Texas next year, they've got one of her police cards that's got her fingerprints on it. And that's one of the things I'm most excited to see, because, you know, like imagining her in that police station and, you know, like doing the fingerprinting, and it's there, it's tangible. And I think it had been digitized, which is how I found it. So obviously that's hugely important, especially if you're researching on an international level, these massive digital archives and all the work that goes into that. But there is just nothing like touching and holding a physical object.
But there's also,
no, say it. But next question, and you keep going. But who would like another question? Is that very okay, we'll go to that lady when you've said this, Natalie.
Oh, no, go.
Right, hold the thought. I think a mic is just coming, if you don't mind waiting for a sec. Thank you.
Hi. Kate, something that you raised about likability, which I'm really curious about. And what I'm hearing with all the other panellists is that you all really like the women that you're writing about. And how difficult would it be if you unearth some information about somebody or you're intrigued, and then as you started to find out more about them, you realise that really they weren't very likeable people? And would you be able to still pursue that? Or are some people's histories best left where they were?
Well, I think, from my point of view, it is a really important part of, we don't expect men to agree with each other because they're men. We assume that everybody will be themselves and have wonderful ideas, and we are living in rather childish times at the moment, but we all know that you can like people enormously and not agree with them on everything. Now, in terms of women, I discovered with my ancestor, Lily Watson, that she was a very active member of the Anti-Suffrage League. Now, you will probably not be surprised to know that is not my opinion. But I'm intrigued. I would love to say, now tell me, explain that to me. It doesn't, and I had to stop myself when I thought, would I have liked her? And I thought, that is not the point. The only way that history can be valuable is for it to be the history of all of us, unmitigated. And although we've talked about you can't trust all the archives and the sources, and we know that, we have to put the monstrous women in the same way that the monstrous men are there, or even the women that we have done wonderful things. For example, the one that is often quoted is Mary Stopes. Very important to women's lives in some ways. Some of her other views are very, very challenging. But do I put her in the book? Well, I did, because she did something that significantly changed women's lives.
A very difficult woman for me to write about was Nancy Astor, who you mentioned before. She was a virulent anti-Semite, and in fact, when she met Chaim Weizmann, she said he was the only decent Jew she'd ever met. Now that was a very very difficult thing for me to tackle, but nonetheless, her story deserves to be told. And the funny thing is that I kind of made the connection. When she said Chaim Weizmann is the only decent Jew I've ever met, when I was researching the Rothschild book, I realised why she thought he was so decent. Because actually Chaim Weizmann was coached by the women of the Rothschild family in order to modulate his tone and be more acceptable to people like Nancy Astor, because
really?
they
society.
realised that the only way that they would ever be able to push the Balfour Declaration through is if they managed to, coach Chaim Weizmann to, speak in the language that the British political elite would understand.
Fascinating.
So
Susan.
I just wanted to answer this because obviously the subject of my first book has a very monstrous woman in it. In fact, the person at the centre of this group, this family of murderers, is a woman. And the reason that the case garnered so much attention at the time was because she was a young, attractive woman who'd made a big effort to make herself known in the local community because she wanted to be a famous medium. And it was really interesting. She was part of what drew me to the case because she was such a kind of corruption of 19th century family values. I mean, she's involved in the murder of a child, which even now is still obviously kind of the most monstrous thing we consider women able to do. But she's also a woman, we don't have any of her voice. We don't know what her background was. We don't know where she came from. We are totally reliant on the construction of her by the press, by people who knew her, by members of the community, by folklore, essentially. And then that was really interesting to me. Like, how do you deal with a woman where you don't know why she is the way she is? And then during the research of the book, I found an account that was written by the wife of one of the victims. And it was really interesting to have a woman whose voice we hear that's very specific. She talks about her husband, her children, her involvement in the search for her husband. She's a very full person. We can really feel her in the book. And then to have that kind of woman against this murderer who we actually don't have any words from, that was a really interesting kind of structure for me to engage with.
Wonderful. Another question. Gentleman at the back. Thank you very much. This is the horrible moment for everybody having to get their steps in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All of your books are, to varying extents, biographies, sort of a genre of history born of great man theory and, by extension, naturally focused on military and political figures. Do you think that by continuing, as we all do, to read history through the lens of individuals, women are naturally going to continue to be left out of it as we continue to focus on political and military figures?
That's a fantastic question.
I find that very interesting because in the case of Leticia Landon, I found that I see what you mean about how biography as a genre naturally sort of, elevates the individual and the relationship between the individual and the context of the individual is the most important. Whereas in the case of Leticia Landon, I found that in order to understand her, I had to reconstruct the entire culture of literary society and of this period that had been very underexplored. And so in her case, I feel that she was almost like a sort of electric current through which all the sort of contradictions of her culture flowed, and I think she was a great object lesson in how in the relationship between the individual and their environment. What do other people think?
I completely, but I really don't, in a funny kind of way, I don't think of my book as a biography at all.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a story of a person, but I think if you're sort of reclaiming a woman's story, then it's got lost for a reason. So you're going to end up writing about a whole culture. And I found myself thinking, well, it's just a question of how wide is the lens going to go? You want to put in the whole context, and then you're on sort of, marriage and the court and what's available to women and can they own, property. And in my case, and I think in yours, what you was saying is it's the story of a period and a culture and a time as much as it's the story of a person. So in a sense, it's not the same at all as writing the biography of a great hero, and then he does this, and then he wins that, and that, that wouldn't work with these kind of...
And also, with the Rothschild women, you cannot understand anything if you don't go back to the will of 1812, because that set the tone for the culture. You also have to look into Jewish culture. You have to understand about customs and how important it was that they married, other Jews. And there's so much more than just the one person if you actually really want to understand what motivates them.
Well, and I think also, society's responses to these women are so much a part of why they've been lost or why they've been excluded or why they've been written about in a certain way. And if you are investigating a woman in this way, all of that has to be a part of it in order to truly understand who she was and why she did what she did.
Well, you know what? Sadly, we've got to bring it to a close. But what I would say, I think you've all done, is that we've started a conversation that belongs so much at Clifton, I would say, about what is history. Who makes it, who gets to decide what matters, and who gets put into the record and who gets taken out. And all of you have been adding to the record. That is the point of this. And I think the last question about the great men of history, that has been the case, but it's about putting the women there as well. And I'm going to leave you with my final favourite story. Women have always done everything. But it was a great delight to me to discover that in 1893, an American woman, clearly a bit fed up at Christmas for nobody clearing up after themselves, left the kitchen in Chicago and went to a shed at the bottom of her garden, and she invented the dishwasher, ladies and gentlemen. So may I thank you, Susan, Catherine and Natalie, and thank you all very much for signing in the case.